Thank you, Ralph, for the kind introduction. I'd like to thank SPME Germany, and obviously I'd like to thank the Middle East Forum of Berlin for co-sponsoring this event and hosting me here. It's been quite some time I've been to Europe, and it's always a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk about the kind of research that I do in European circles as well as in American circles as well as in Israel. As Ralph mentioned, my remarks tonight are going to focus on the Oslo Peace Accords and the right of return and the question of refugees. I've spent close to over a decade trying to understand the anomaly of Palestinian refugees. I started getting involved in this question during my Army service, dealing with different international organizations that dealt with aid to the Palestinians, and one of them was UNRWA, which is the UN Worker Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees. It is the only UN agency entirely devoted to Palestinian refugees, and that led to my research and my forthcoming book on the phenomenon of the Palestinian refugees. When you look at this, the topic of Palestinian refugees, I think you have to understand the history of the conflict and to actually see how it feeds into the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. We are now over 20 years since the Oslo Peace Accords, and we're not even closer to a negotiations with the Palestinians. I would actually argue that we're further away than we were in 1991 when the backdoor discussion started with Madrid. And so part of what I'll talk about tonight is the challenges and the obstacles, but I'll focus predominantly on this anomaly of Palestinian refugees and how they feed into this larger matrix. By the end of 1948, 1949, what you have on the ground is you have an environment that has shifted as a result of Israel's War of Independence, and you have the beginning of the question of Palestinian refugees. The scholarship differs as far as how many came about by the end of 1949. The accepted number is between 650,000 and 700,000 that came about by the end of the war. And the question of their status became an ongoing issue. Right at the outset, there was an understanding by the Arab world, and this ties into the claim or the reasons why Palestinian refugees came about, is who was responsible for their creation to begin with. The two competing narratives that are played out are one blaming Israel for the creation of the refugee problem, also ties into the Nakba narrative that is Israel's creation at large as a catastrophic event, and the other has to do, which really are the facts on the ground, have to do with the fact that the majority of the Palestinians who left, the refugees who left the area defined as mandatory Palestine, were told to leave by the Arab world, and the message was, and I'm paraphrasing here, that once we eradicate the Zionist entity, then you'll be able to come back to your homes. That was the expected outcome of the war. When that did not happen, then the refugee problem came about. As a result of the architecture created in 1949, the United Nations comes about and decides that the Arabs of Palestine are a unique and different refugee population at large. And the organization that was created entirely devoted to the Palestinian refugees is one that we become known as UNRWA, the UN Workers Relief Agency for Palestine. And this organization, over the past 60-some years, has devoted an entire raison d'etre to the existence of Palestinian refugees. What has been striking me about this organization that while it was supposed to be an organization that would facilitate and work towards resolving the problem, actually it became the gatekeeper of the Palestinian refugees at large. To UNRWA's credit, and the research that I've done, in the first 10 years of UNRWA's existence, from 1949 to, I would say, the early 1960s, UNRWA indeed tried to stay true to its humanitarian mandate, to actually try to facilitate what is defined, if anybody looks at State Department documentation, and Western and American foreign policy in the region at the time, it had to deal with the issue of reintegration, resettlement, and rehabilitation was the accepted foreign policy in the region. The fact of the matter is, unfortunately, that there was a lot of pushback from making that happen. And what you did see is the fact that UNRWA, that was created in 1949 as an Article 22 by the General Assembly, what that means in practical terms is UNRWA is dependent entirely on voluntary contributions. The voluntary contributions that were predicated by the Arab world were predicated on the fact that UNRWA would become a true advocate for the Palestinian cause. That is to say, that if you want the money coming from the Arab world, you have to become this true advocate of the Palestinian cause, and that's where we saw this transformation of UNRWA to become a full-fledged advocate for the Palestinian cause. It is also, interestingly enough, to look at the fact that UNRWA uniquely defines refugees like no other organizations at large. It is the organization that defines Palestinians and refugees at large in the most expansive way possible. The definition of UNRWA for a refugee is anybody who was in Palestine between 1946 and 1948, meaning 2 years prior to the creation of the State of Israel, and their descendants. Again, the caveat of descendantry is very critical here when you're looking and trying to understand the anomaly of refugees, because what you do see here over the past 60 years is that while other refugee populations decreased over the years, UNRWA is the only organization that maintains, and actually the numbers continue to grow over the years. So while UNRWA's numbers today are between 7 to 8 million, basically if we continue on the track that we're on today, we can be talking about 20, 30 million down the road. In comparison, and you're really in the striking contrast to UNRWA's, to the sister organization that was created by the United Nations, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, refugees are only one generation. No issue of descendantry, the fact that you are only a refugee for one generation, and basically the assumption is that you'll be able to assimilate and move on. We've seen history of refugees and population swaps over the years. It is only the Arabs and the Palestinians that define this in this most expansive way. It is also critical to understand when you are trying to analyze this, is the fact that at the end of 1949, by the end of the war, the Arab world made a conscious decision to keep the refugees in this status of refugees. With the exception of Jordan, no Arab country ever offered the Palestinian citizenship. And so, and to quote one of the heads of UNRWA in 1951, the head of the Amman office, Sir Alexander Galloway, quote, and I'm paraphrasing here, was basically to keep the refugee problem as an open wound, as a sore, as an affront to the Arab world, because the Arab world does not give a damn about the refugees. And that narrative has kept and has made this symbolism what Palestinians stand for. The argument, if you fast forward to the environment today, while you can always argue that the Palestinians are stateless, and the fact that they have not been able to become beyond refugees is a mechanism to blame Israel, the West, and everybody else for why the Palestinians have not been able to rehabilitate over the past 65 years and maintaining in the status of refugees. Critical and important to understand, and something that I think is fundamental to understand the aspect of refugees today and refugees back in the 1950s. Palestinian identity is synonymous to refugees. To argue that one is no longer a refugee is to argue that one is no longer a Palestinian. Sure. Sorry. That simple understanding needs to be critically understood why there has been a pushback of trying to accept and resolve the right of return. Because in essence, if you say to a Palestinian you're no longer a refugee, you're also giving up one's identity. Even Palestinian scholars would argue that if you try to dissect Palestinian identity Anti-Zionism and anti-Israelism is a part of that, a percentage, but they will say that it is only a small percentage. I would argue it's the opposite. I would argue that it's close to 75 to 85% anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and that until the Palestinians are able to create and carve out an independent Palestinian identity that's independent from anti-Zionism, this will not go away. That's part of how this feeds into the peace process. But the fact that you have Palestinian identity entangled with the Palestinian refugees, and the fact that it is really the number one issue that continues to exacerbate the problem, is why we have this environment today. The other aspect that's worth understanding, and one could argue historically, well, how come there have not been attempts to resolve this problem? There have been many attempts to resolve this problem over the years. The fact is that they've always been rejected in favor of not accepting Israel's right to exist. Case in point, my book deals directly with one of the preambles to UNRWA, which were the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee. And the Quakers were actually received their mandate from Eleanor Roosevelt after they worked in the DP camps in Europe after the war. And they received the mandate to deal and were attracted to the idea of coming to work with Arabs and Jews in the Middle East. It was a hard-pressed opposition to turn down, and they were very attracted to the idea. The Quakers believed, because of their pacifist ideology, that they'll be able to come and actually serve as a neutral party. And they indeed come to the region, and they're in Gaza for about 18 months, trying to deal with the problem of the refugees. The Quakers were able to negotiate, and some of the proposals that were put forth by the Quakers when they were dealing with Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharet in the early 50s was about Israel taking in a number of refugees. Israel already in 1951-52 agreed to take in, as part of that 650,000 refugees that came about, close to 350,000 refugees. When they made that offer, the only caveat for that to happen was to accept Israel's right to exist in peace. That was flatly rejected, with the idea that, again, if we're keeping this alive, there is no need to have any kind of peace with Israel and with the Jewish state. It's ironic, if you look at the documentation that I unearthed in the 50s, it was interesting to see that Israel was actually, the claim toward the state of Israel already in 51, 52 was that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that you, Israel, as a democratic state, like the former Soviet Union and like America, have an obligation and a responsibility to solve the refugee problem because you created it. And that was a kind of narrative that was being festered and being perpetuated within the UN circles and within the General Assembly. The idea, this is what needs to happen by selling this atrocity that exists. It is also the reason why individuals all the way from Nasser, all the way to bin Laden, to Ahmadinejad, have used the Palestinian symbol to say, look at the Palestinian refugees, the atrocity that's happening in the Middle East. How have you made that happen? And until we have solved this problem, we will not solve the peace process. And so unfortunately, and really to the detriment and the tragedy, is that the Palestinian refugees have been kept alive as a mechanism to galvanize Arab-Palestinian suffering without an attempt by the Arab world to actually take in and try to solve the problem. I mentioned Jordan before. Jordan did offer Palestinian citizenship. Jordan is another problem. I'm happy to address that in the Q&A. But the fact that Jordan is close to 70% Palestinian originates from the fact that Jordan did agree to take in Palestinians at large. Lebanon, before the Arab Spring, afforded Palestinian refugees an elevated status, not the ability to own land, but they gave them the ability to have certain skills and to have certain opportunities from the medical profession to the legal profession. But beyond that, really the Palestinians have not been able to receive this kind of reception by the Arab world. To that end, Israel became the sole caretaker, in many regards, of the Palestinian refugees. in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, when Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza in the aftermath of the war, then Israel was actually the first country to tell the Palestinian refugees, you should leave the camps. Leave the camps and build your own homes. And if you don't want us to build the homes for you, then we will allocate the land and go do it on your own. Obviously, that was also rejected. This was the policy by Levi Eshkol at the time in 1968. Interestingly enough, if you remember the historical narrative of what's been happening at this certain period of time, Yasser Arafat, the founder of the PLO, is recruiting for the struggle against Palestine. If the Palestinians left the camps, and if they left the struggle, and if there was an opportunity for a better lifestyle, and a better middle class, a valuable middle class, why would they support the revolution? Again, that is flatly rejected. What is critical, beyond understanding this historical narrative that exists here, is also the fact that because the blame of the creation of the refugees was put on the West and on Israel, it deflected responsibility of the outcome of the war from the Arab world. In addition to that, what it did from a financial standpoint is put the West, and predominantly Western countries, including Germany, the EU at large, and the United States, as the largest funders of the Palestinian refugees. Because UNRWA is dependent on voluntary contributions, on aid to the Palestinians, we have given UNRWA over the past 60-some years billions and billions of dollars to solve the problem, but this money has basically created a safeguard for the Palestinian refugees. This money has created an infrastructure where there is no incentive to resolve the problem. Of late, Germany, I believe, we're here in Germany, so I'll mention it, of course, was ranked in 2010 as the 11th country contributing to UNRWA in the tone of $15 million. In 2013, they gave $7 million. This is a lot of money that we're putting into UNRWA. The United States funds a third of UNRWA's annual budget in the tone of $250 million that the taxpayer dollars are funding. And what's important to understand about this money and what this does is that the anomaly is also predicated on the number of refugees. So if the number of refugees continues to grow, then you're also continuing to have more and more people you need to feed. And so we have a fine amount of money, and the question is, where is all that money going? Accountability and transparency is a critical problem that we are dealing with today. The fact is that when UNRWA goes to Congress and when UNRWA goes to any country in the world to ask for money, all UNRWA has to say is, we take care of the betterment of Palestinian refugees, write me a large check. And there is hardly any kind of accountability and transparency about what this money actually funds. Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois, when he was still a congressman 10 years ago, when I started dealing with him in Washington on the Hill, his first question to UNRWA, he is a former World Bank employee, was, can we see an audit? When he had the audacity to ask for that, UNRWA went ballistic and said, how dare you ask for an audit? We're taking care of the Palestinians. Why would you even question the fact that we need to actually show you where that money is actually going? The problem with UNRWA at large is UNRWA does have a hold on Palestinian society. UNRWA has a monopoly on all of what happens in the Palestinian camps at large. When I've interviewed Palestinian refugees, and when you talk to Palestinian refugees, you will ask them, they understand themselves that a full right of return will never come to fruition. However, they do understand there will be monetary compensation. So what you do see is that the majority of Palestinians are already settled. And what they do is they leave a shack or a garage in one of the camps to show validation that they're still refugees. When there is resolution to the Palestinian right of return, then they will be able to show we deserve this kind of compensation. But what is critical to understand here, in going back to this anomaly of the definition of UNRWA, that even Arab Israelis, who are citizens of the State of Israel, according to UNRWA's account, are also still refugees. People who are living abroad, of other citizenship. they all fall into UNRWA's accounts. Not to mention the fact them and their descendants. Muslim lineage is also a patriarchal system. It also goes based on the father. Of late, they've also included the mother in order to expand the generation. We have more refugees, all claiming Palestinian refugee status. And if you contrast with what I'm saying, and if you take, if UNRWA were to adopt, for example, the definition of UNHCR, which is one generation, if we were talking about a full right of return for all Palestinian refugees today of 1948, 1949, the number wouldn't be more than 35,000 individuals. Israel could take that in. And the reason that Israel does not accept a full right of return, left, right, or center Israeli government, is because it would alter a demographic majority of the state of Israel. And the threat and the idea of trying to position the right of return also threatens exactly the existence of the state of Israel. And so, take that understanding, that explains exactly why every time a Palestinian official, from Yasser Arafat to Mahmoud Abbas, when he went to the United Nations General Assembly to ask for unilateral declaration of independence, he says, yes, I want a Palestinian state tomorrow, but I'm not willing to give up the right of return. And the right of return is exactly what I was talking about before as it relates to this concept of Palestinian identity. It must be understood in that way to understand why this rejectionist mentality exists in order to basically fuel the idea that we are refugees forever. Furthermore, if you take all this historical narrative that I'm explaining to you and exactly how it has played out over the past 65 years, and parachute this within the context of the peace process. If you take the peace process at large, you can basically boil it down to three issues. 1967 borders, a shared capital of Jerusalem, and a right of return. I would argue that the two, 67 and Jerusalem, could be worked out. The number one issue that exacerbates and fuels the conflict is a right of return. And as long as there is a right of return still always in the background, that is what ensures the continuation of the conflict. In Oslo, the biggest mistake we've made, and people, not even myself, people like Dennis Ross and others would argue that we left all the difficult issues at the final status negotiations because they were difficult to resolve at the time. The idea was defined as CBMs, confident building measures, the idea of trying to create an infrastructure to try to solve the problem. However, when you look at the right of return at large, it ensures the fact that the problem will never go away. The initiative that was happening currently in the United States, and in Israel actually in tandem, is for the first time the state of Israel is also trying to deal with this issue. If you look at Israel, Israel has had a problem, not been a problem per se, but a problem at large trying to deal with UNRWA because Israeli foreign policy is as difficult, as complicated, as bad as UNRWA is, they are not worse. And meaning in practical terms that if UNRWA doesn't take responsibility for the Palestinian refugees, it's going to be our problem. And that's why Israel has never voted to dissolve or dismantle UNRWA at large. However, now by former MK Einat Vilf, in tandem with what Mark Kirk and others have been doing in the United States, we've been trying to work with the idea of ending the right of return. Ending the right of return, meaning to have an end date to the right of return, in order to try to work at bookending that you can no longer claim refugee status. It's not to say, and the bill doesn't argue, that you can no longer receive services, or people who are already receiving services are going to have their services stopped. It's just the idea of going forward, you can no longer claim refugee status. And the fact that you can still receive aid under different kind of programs, but no longer under the title of refugees. Because, again, the fact that UNRWA's entire raison d'etre is based on the existence of refugees. And if the number of refugees continue to grow, when is UNRWA going to leave the scene? UNRWA's official line, when I've gone and questioned UNRWA officials and whatnot, they will tell you, we will leave the scene when there is resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You make that same statement in the vein while you're perpetuating the right of return, which ensures it will never end. Another aspect to consider when you're looking at Palestinian refugees, and the reason there is no pushback by Palestinians to end this on their part as well. UNRWA's major service provider is educational. The majority of Palestinians are educated by the UNRWA school system, to a point where the former Minister of Education of the Palestinian Authority was a superintendent of the UNRWA schools. To find a Palestinian who argue UNRWA does bad things is hardly to come by. But the other aspect that needs to be considered the fact is that UNRWA is the largest employer of Palestinians. UNHCR, which deals with refugees worldwide, has no more than 5,000 to 6,000 employees, all internationals. UNRWA, on the other hand, has close in the tone of 30,000 individuals who are majority Palestinian. UNRWA's entire integrity as a humanitarian, as a central, as a neutral party has been compromised by hiring Palestinians. So if you're the largest employer of Palestinians, why would you argue that we have to be dissolved? Policy implication of all of this, and when you're looking at the peace process at large, and position is that basically what you have today when you're trying to analyze the Palestinian Authority is that UNRWA is a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. All these services that should be delivered by the Palestinian state to be by the Palestinian Authority should be PA services. Social, medical, sanitary issues, all the services that UNRWA provides should be given by the Palestinian Authority. However, what you have today is you have an environment where you have what is considered to be double dipping. The UNRWA gets sets of money from the international community. Palestinian Authority gets sets of money as well. All this money goes into Palestinian society, and we see no accountability about this. And that's the challenge. Excuse me. Of late, as a positive note, as far as what has happened in the West, and I think it should be also noted here tonight, is the fact that because of this anomaly, because of this monopoly that exists, Canada became the first Western country to defund entirely from UNRWA. And interestingly enough, the impetus for Canada's defunding entirely from UNRWA, because they have this black hole, we don't know where the money is going, I have no idea where my Canadian dollars are going, was based on an EU report. On an EU report that was talking about the kind of incitement that exists within Palestinian textbooks, within UNRWA schools, the kind of environment that ensures the perpetuation of the conflict. So Canada said, this is a problem. We're going to give money to the Palestinian Authority because we can get some kind of measurable outcomes as far as where my money is going. However, I'm no longer giving money to UNRWA. And that's the challenge. This is what I would argue the number one issue that we need to look at and try to understand when we're trying to resolve and trying to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. As I said before, and I can't stress this enough, the fact that Palestinian identity is synonymous to Palestinian refugees, the fact that the right of return is the main catalyst for perpetuating the conflict, these issues need to be addressed head on. And until we have a full-fledged look at what UNRWA does and what UNRWA should be doing, we're not going to work toward resolving the problem. Now, you could ask me, what are the steps to make this happen? The steps are, I am not suggesting that we should basically cut off Palestinians entirely from UNRWA services and we should stop providing money. What I am suggesting is that we start breaking the monopoly. And I am suggesting that from a practical sense, UNRWA needs to be weaned off of Palestinian society in order to have some kind of end date to the problem. There are multiple agencies within the United Nations that do parallel things to what UNRWA does, from UNICEF to WHO and other organizations that deal with different aspects that UNRWA provides today. And if we want to start receiving some kind of accountability and some kind of measurable outcomes to see exactly what am I funding, that we have to start breaking that monopoly. And ultimately, if there is going to be a move toward Palestinian statehood, this should be the responsibility of the state to be. You cannot have a state and be a refugee at the same time. Since World War II, there have been approximately 145 million refugees worldwide. All have been resolved, with the exception of one population, the Palestinians. There has not been an incentive whatsoever to resolve this problem. As I've gone across Palestinian communities and I've interviewed people and I've talked to them, that is the exact sentiment that I get, even in the largest communities in the Palestinian diaspora in the United States, or in Dearborn, Michigan, and Jacksonville, Florida, of the original 1948. And you go and talk to these individuals, they will tell you we're first and foremost Palestinian. Interestingly enough, which is also something we don't hear much about, is that I was able to unearth an Arabic op-ed in Dearborn, Michigan in 1949. And for the first time, I saw handwritten op-eds talking about the fact that why are we not looking to the Sultan, why are we blaming the West and not looking to the princes and the sultans of the Arab world? Why are they not taking care of us if they're our Arab brethren? It was interesting to find those kind of voices, but you hear those voices less and less in the Palestinian diaspora, but there were some of those voices that had a kind of a long-range perspective about who is to blame for the creation of Palestinian refugees and the fact that they were kept in this situation. The fact of the matter is that if anybody looks at the archives of what took place in 1948, 1949, the majority left because they were told to leave. The outcome was preordained. The assumption was that Israel would not come to fruition, and the fact that the Palestinians would be able to come back to where they were. But the fact of the matter is that there has been an entire rejectionism of the reality on the ground, of the entire history, of the facts that came about. Looking at the Zionist archives and looking at exactly the reality of 1948 and prior to that, the policy of the nascent Jewish state was to reach out to the Arab world and to reach out to the Arabs of Palestine and say, stay. We had relationships before the war. We want to continue on with that. Don't wage war on us. And those Arab Israelis, who indeed became Israeli citizens by process of naturalization, are indeed Israeli citizens. Those who left, that's where this refugee element comes from. However, there has not been a conscious decision to try to deal with this issue. The concept was to keep it alive. Even if you look at the history of UNRWA, and especially even if you look at the history of the Quakers, the reason the Quakers left, and the last Quakers left Gaza and Akko and Ramallah, where they had bases of operation, were because they came to the conclusion that the UN is a red tape bureaucracy, and they're not going to help resettle the problem. Interestingly enough, even as pacifists, and they had a lot of issues, the one positive thing that I point to in my study is the fact that UNRWA could have had lessons learned from the Quakers. Had they learned the lessons and the same problems that we talk about today, vis-a-vis who is a refugee, where they came from, the inflation of numbers, the challenges that exist within the Palestinian infrastructure, were all identified by the Quakers. UNRWA could have had and learned those lessons and tried to solve the problem early on. However, they decided to ignore them. In my book, I talk about the fact, and I'll give you even more illustrative fact, about how UN workers came to deal with the Egyptians who were in Gaza and trying to deal with the Arabs. And one of the Quaker workers tells one of the new workers of UNRWA, here, let me come and take you around, I'll show you around and who the people are in charge and understand the reality on the ground. And his response was, what are you talking about? I have here a case of whiskey I was told to bring it to the Egyptians, and that's how we're going to do business, by giving them alcohol. Again, that's little bit of an anecdotal point about the issue of how this bureaucracy came about. But from a pragmatic standpoint, UNRWA is predominantly funded, with the exception, obviously, of Arab money that goes into UNRWA as basically what I would say is blood, guilt money to say that we don't want to solve the problem, we'll pay our dues to you as long as you take care of the Palestinians and become this full-fledged advocate which you have become. But the other sets of money which continue to fuel the problem is Western money. Euros and dollars that continue to go into this problem. And if you look at the larger economy today, and look at, we all have, all of us have economic problems, and we have, different issues domestically, and we have to really take a realistic look about the kind of money we're putting into different organizations. And I think that we have a fine amount of money that we're pouring into this, but with the attempt of trying to solve the problem. The fact that we are pouring in millions and billions of dollars into an organization that has no end, namely an organization that was created, importantly, as a temporary organization. UNRWA was created as a temporary organization that has no end. The temporary and then the kind of the ness of UNRWA at large became a fact on the ground 65 years later, with still no vision of trying to solve the problem at large. And my final message, and I know I threw out a lot of information, I'm happy to tackle any questions in English, in German if you translate it to me, and I'm happy to explain them as well, is that if we care about trying to resolve the conflict, if we care about the two-state solution, whatever that's going to be and what it's going to be like, the number one issue for us to deal with head-on is the Palestinian right of return. And what trickles down from that is questioning the services that UNRWA provides, and does UNRWA actually have an end date to what is happening in the region? It's interestingly enough to see today that on the heels of the Arab Spring, Islamist winter, what's currently happening in Syria, where you really truly have refugees in dire conditions, is that the Palestinian cause actually has been marginalized because of all the suffering. And it's interestingly enough to even look at the case study of Syria, because Syria actually is home to the original refugees of 1948, 1949. The majority of them went to Syria. And so there is a strong Palestinian element within Syria. And they understand all of this mentality. But what you are hearing as interesting comments is that refugees who are fleeing now Syria saying, let the Palestinians take care of themselves. We have real issues. And so, one should question, where is UNRWA on those issues when you have true refugees and a problem here, and you're only focused on one element that continues to exacerbate a problem that you are ensuring that has no end? So on that note, let me end my remarks, but I think that we have to take a critical look at trying to resolve the problem, but the only way to do it is actually taking on head-on the right of return. Unless that is taken on in a serious manner and looked at to create a Palestinian state to be, unfortunately, I would argue we're going to be in the same situation 10, 15 years down the road. So on that note, I thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Asaf. Really a lot of information. And as I suggested, I will start with 1 or 2 or 3 questions, and then we will open this microphone. My first question is in one direction. I think you convinced us that the current status of this UNRWA, that we are all financing indirectly by our tax money, by the UN, that it's not a good situation right now. It is like a government, and the Palestinians have been used to this. My question is, what would be a positive perspective? How could that be changed? And you threw in a word, not sure if everybody knows that. You said the Palestinians have to be weaned off. And in German, I think that means abstillen oder entwöhnen. So it's like a mother feeding his child all the time, and of course, for a certain time, it has to get rid of that habit. But how could that be done? You told us about transparency. Huh? We have to ask where is the money going? What is happening?
Yeah, sure.
Do you have suggestions? How could you envision something to become better there?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, the pushback is, and I mentioned this in my remarks, has to do with the fact that you will rarely find a Palestinian who will say UNRWA doesn't take care of me or UNRWA does bad things. If there is going to be a Palestinian state to be, there has to be a slow but transition off of UNRWA. The challenge of UNRWA is UNRWA has this larger monopoly of all these services. Everything falls under UNRWA's responsibility, from social to educational to healthcare, falls under UNRWA's control. And so what I'm saying is that and I actually had this conversation when I interviewed former UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. We had this longer conversation about what can be done to actually slowly deal with this matrix. Is there has to be a breakdown of different and parallel agencies that do similar things, but only focus on one aspect. So the social aspect is going to be given to one UN agency. The doctors will be given to who? UNICEF will take care of the children. I mean, at least in a sense, at the beginning, to actually break down exactly where this money is going. So if you're giving money, EU's euros are going to fund X, Y, and Z, because I can fund the project, I'm dealing with education in Palestinian schools, and I'm going through UNICEF. So I can get a receipt and say, I've done X, Y, and Z. At this point, as I mentioned in my first remarks, basically we're writing large checks to UNRWA with the assumption they'll do it all. And so the weaning off aspect really has to take place here. The other element, which I think is critical and to understand, is the fact that UNRWA, unlike any other organization, unlike any refugee organization, originally was mandated not to get involved in politics because it takes away from the neutrality. What you have today is that UNRWA became a shadow government for the Palestinian Authority. And the reason we were able to kind of figure out Palestinian voting blocks was because the majority of the employees of UNRWA are actually UNRWA teachers. And what we would do is we're able to see exactly what political bloc they represent. And so what you have is a kind of a reciprocity. UNRWA teachers become UNRWA superintendents, and they become again in the UNRWA schools, and they teach again the kind of incitement and the rhetoric that we find within Palestinian textbooks, which are taught. Because the mandate of UNRWA is to teach based on the host country. If the host country is Hamas, then we're definitely getting a Hamas narrative that plays out. And so, if you look at UNRWA textbooks, for example, there is no recognition of the state of Israel. Israel is not found on the map. In Jerusalem, it is entirely Al-Aqsa. I mean, none of the stuff that you would consider to be peace-building measures are found in UNRWA textbooks. Some of that stuff I would consider my own twins watched that to be child abuse. I mean, the kind of rhetoric that exists and the kind of aspects that play out here. So looking and breaking down that monopoly, looking at the curriculum, looking at the kind of things that are being taught, need to be carefully looked at. And it can only happen if you break down this monopoly. The other aspect, which is going to be much harder but needs to be looked at carefully, is really drilling down on the fact that the majority of UNRWA employees are local Palestinians. And so until we actually say, okay, you have to take care of responsibility of yourself, create a valuable state, it's going to function, you can't depend on us as caretakers of you to continue on this problem. And that's what's been happening, that kind of reciprocity. Other symptoms of this problem have led to the fact that UNRWA's integrity, UN immunity has been lost. The fact that UNRWA schools have been used to transport munitions, UNRWA vehicles have been used to transport suicide bombers. These are all symptoms of a larger problem that we find on the ground today. And I think that those are obviously, very critical things to look at. My point is that the history of UNRWA created this infrastructure that allowed this to come about, and the definitions and the infrastructure really ensured the fact that this will have no end. And the larger symptoms that are coming about are only ensuring the fact that it will continue to grow. But it has to, we have to break this monopoly, and this is where you have to begin.
I mean, these late remarks didn't sound that optimistic. It sounded like it's UN is such a large organization, and it's now so powerful, and if it's so corrupt that it even transports, as you said, Thomas, can we, or would you recommend maybe to go to your local politician that may then relate to, I don't know, foreign politics, to not, or to try to control those organizations? I don't like that we go away from here and say, well, this is just something that's happening there, it has been there forever, it will grow, the problem will grow, it will block peace.
Sure.
You're a little bit more optimistic.
No, absolutely. I mean, these initiatives that I mentioned that I've been involved with over the past few years, and the initiative that Democratic Congressman Steve Rothman and now Senator Mark Kirk and Liana Roth-Lake in the United States, Einat Vilch, the former MK in Israel, people are starting to look at UNRWA in a more critical way. People are starting to look at UNRWA in a critical way here in Europe and also in the United States. I mean, the idea is because we are stakeholders in perpetuating this problem, we have a right to know where our money is going. And so the fact that I've been working even with the Committee of Foreign Relations with the EU. I mean, they're also concerned about UNRWA money, where that's going. I mean, money is tight, and I think that we have there's a responsibility for us as stakeholders as where our money is going. Yes, we want Palestinians to take responsibility for their own. We want them to be educated. We want them to be, we want them to be valuable. We want to create a middle class. These are all positive things. However, they're being blocked by this mechanism. And I think that's what needs to be looked at here if we want to get some kind of responsibility. So yes, I think that only in 2013, every time UNRWA's consistent messages is they never have enough money. Never have enough money since they were created. And they continuously go and ask for more money from different countries. Even with Syria now, they're saying, you see, there are more problems, you need to give us more money. Just 2 months ago, Berlin committed 7 million euros to UNRWA for new special projects. This is an ongoing issue, and I think that everybody in the room has, should be talking to their elected officials and saying, where's our money going? Give me receipts. In the 1990s, when Oslo was happening, we made the biggest mistake with Yasser Arafat. Arafat went around and said, we want to have a Palestinian state, that's going to be very costly. You got to write me a large check. And we gave millions and millions of dollars to Yasser Arafat. So we got smarter. So now we're saying, you know what? If the Palestinians want to buy iPads and Macs, they got to show us receipts. They got to go buy it, or we get some kind of accountability and transparency. However, this is not happening with them. They're held to a different set of standards. And so, yes, they, if you ask them, oh yes, they become a little bit more diligent on the fact that we're doing some background checks as far as including, terrorism and whatnot. But the fact is, if you look historically, what you have is you have UNRWA teachers who are teachers by day and members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad by night, science teachers and others. And there's been this compromise as far as what UNRWA actually does. So I think that by all means, anybody, we can look at exactly what we're doing. Not to say don't give money, but even if you look at the Canadian example as some kind of model of a Western country, Canada said, I get no accountability and transparency from where my money is going to UNRWA. I will give to projects within the Palestinian Authority as long as I know where my money is going. And that we have a right to do. Absolutely.
When you're talking about responsibility, maybe one more aspect. Looking at Egypt, Arab Spring, Muslim Brotherhood, now they're gone, connection to Hamas. There is, of course, the neighbors, they are also responsible. I mean, some of the refugees, so-called refugees, they came from them. Their relatives there, the same religion there, the same culture. Still, Egypt to Gaza's border was so close, so everybody accused Israel of strangling Gaza. So we could point to these countries, say, you should also take care. On the other hand, like you said, if we say, okay, the UN and we, the Western world, will not support anymore, if only the Arab world will step in and finance, then of course we don't have any control of what's happening. So how do you see that? I mean, the context of Arab Spring uprising.
Listen, in the context of the Arab Spring, what's become very, very evident is the fact that the Palestinian issue has been marginalized. And there has been an attempt by groups like Hamas and others to bring it back to the Palestinians. Case in point, every respective demonstration from Tunis at the Tahrir Square were all defined by Hamas's intifadas. And again, that's the relationship that Palestinians define the relationship with Israel, the struggle and the uprising. And so the argument was that if every one of these respective countries is having their own successful intifada, then it's an indicator that we too, Palestinians, will have our own revolution and we too will succeed. But the fact of the matter is that the money has been going into other causes and not going directly to the Palestinian cause. And so there's been an attempt to bring it back to them. It would be phenomenal if any of the Arab countries said, you know what, come and be in, but that hasn't been the case. Even Jordan, which is, I think, is probably the closest case study to look at. The Queen herself, Queen Rania, is of Palestinian descent. And she's made open comments about the fact that Palestine is only on the other side of the River Jordan, and that can only be resolved over there. And so she was very clear about the narrative. The Palestinian issue is the biggest conundrum that the king faces today. It always has been an issue, going back even to the 1970s when the PLO under Black September tried to take over Jordan. I mean, Hussein kicked them out. There's a reason for all of that. And I think that it's been very convenient to say that we're not responsible for the refugees. And it's the Western responsibility. And that ties into Israel's creation at large. That Israel's creation was a mistake. That Israel's creation was a catastrophe. They robbed the land. That is the Arab narrative. And the outcome of that is the biggest atrocity that ever came about. That is the refugees. And so we want to keep it open because it's a reminder that what happened in 48, 49 is an awful thing. And that's what we have to look at this. The other part, which is part of this element of cognitive dissonance that exists, when you tell people are refugees, then the perception is that people are fleeing for their lives, living in tents, no running water, no electricity. That's not the case. The majority of, they have Wi-Fi, they have cable, they got malls, they're living in a better environment than you think they are. But the perception in the West is that because we don't be responsible for the starvation of Palestinians, we give money. And so I'm saying we should help make this happen, and there's going to be an end game as far as an actual Palestinian functioning state. But we have to have accountability for where our money is going. And UNRWA is ensuring the fact that this is safeguarding the fact that they're going to continue to be refugees forever. And that needs to be addressed immediately.
Okay. Are there questions from the audience? I see. Are you handing the microphone or you want to place the question? Was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'll try to.
One question about the Oslo process. I think it's a common knowledge that it's long, or at least the West and the US are thinking this, as long as Palestinians and Israelis talk with each other, there's less war, less atrocities, and less deaths. Now we got a new initiative called the Carry Initiative, and I'd like to know a little bit if you could elaborate a little bit your assessment about the ongoing talks in Jerusalem and Ramallah, and There's been some progress last week, as we heard that the Kerry government, Kerry brought on General Allen, and he made a proposal about the security issues, one of the big issues, the security for Israel, about the presence of the IDF in the Jordan Valley. So you could perhaps a bit elaborate on that and how you see that.
Sure.
Maybe should we collect 3 questions and then you can summarize a little bit?
Whatever you want.
Okay. And I start, I think, from right to left. Elvira, and behind Elvira, and then we move on. So we have to walk up there. You don't have a violence.
I have to grow up. There was an option that one can pay reparations to the Arab refugees to make them stay wherever they are or settle down. And I have an issue of the Jewish refugees from the Arab states, which have never been raised by Israelis, which was a historical mistake. And now this, I think, should be raised in return, because the Jews who fled or were exiled from the Arab lands, Arab countries, left everything behind, and they were not poor.
My name is Ron. Just 2 things. You mentioned Canada as being a precedent I just want to point out something that in September there's been a new Australian government that's been elected that's a lot more friendly to Israel. But one thing that it did say, and I might have been missed in the news, was about 2 weeks ago, where the Australian government said they would no longer be voting popularly with the rest of the other countries in the United Nations. And Canada and Australia are very, very similar countries, both being in the Commonwealth, both being OECD countries, and it might be a point of departure to link the 2 countries in terms of the same kind of agenda. But the other question I would like to point out is...
I was in Australia 2 years ago. I was talking to a lot of politicians about that at the time.
Yeah, but with Canada already having led the way, it makes it easier because they're both very similar kind of countries. What I want to ask you is, you talked about double dipping. What's going on in Syria at the moment, you probably have the two refugee agencies involved. What are the chances of double dipping in that area of the conflict? And the other thing I would like to ask is, where do we go? Has Resolution 242 of the United Nations Security, has that been forgotten, or is it still valid?
Thank you. I'll start with the first question. The Kerry initiative and the question about, in General Allen, as far as security, I mean, the mandate and the goal of the U.S. administration has been so far, because there's been no direct negotiations, is an attempt to bring the 2 parties together. And obviously, the main question for Israel has always been the concern of security, who's going to be responsible. That's why there's been a great deal of focus trying to maintain security of the Jewish state. Related to that, the question, the last question as far as 242, one of the reasons that the resolution talks about land for peace and not the land for peace, which is what the Arab has inserted into the interpretation of 242, is because what the Israeli narrative talks about was considered to be defensible boundaries. And what are the lands that they can, when they talk about majority of Jewish population? So related to that, we've been seeing a lot of discussions about the areas of E1 and E2, Ma'ale Adumim, Gush Etzion, the suburb of Jerusalem, and how they fall when you're going to have what is considered to be land swamps. What Kerry has been doing, and the kind of initiative that's been being put forth, similar to other initiatives that have been put forth by the State Department and others, was the idea of trying to have direct negotiation, bring them back to the table and deal. And so they haven't even come to the point of tackling the issues of right of return, Jerusalem, and whatnot. It's basically been about bringing the party together and trying to see where can we go forward. And so that's going to be the next step. Of late as well, Martin Indig has been appointed as the envoy. Indig is a former ambassador to Israel. David Makovsky, who is the former editor of a Jerusalem Post, and of late with the Washington Institute, has been appointed to help facilitate that. These are people who've been around and dealing with the issues. Interestingly enough, even observers and people who've been active in the process in the Oslo years, from Aaron David Miller to Dennis Ross and others, what we have seen is that everybody acknowledges that Oslo, became a failure because of the Yasser Arafat. We put all our bets in the Yasser Arafat. We expected Arafat to change his tone up until the end of the Clinton years. And so the question was also, after Arafat's death in 2004, is sincere Palestinian leadership. I mean, we're still working with the assumption of what was considered to be, even under the Bush administration, of the no partner program, trying to have a partner of peace, sit down and have direct negotiations, and to try to deal with that. And so that's what the carry here has been about, with the assumption that the number one issue for Israel has been security issues, and on the flip side for the Palestinians has been land issues. So they've been trying to deal with that head on vis-a-vis, I will guarantee your security, and then we'll deal with the land issues. Also, interestingly enough, those of you who followed the latest Saban conference where Obama spoke at and others, it was one of the first times that there was an acknowledgement that Gaza is off the table. Also to tell you that there is at least a beginning of an understanding of Islamist groups and what they represent, and the fact that American foreign policy and Israeli foreign policy are similar. That is, that they do not negotiate with terrorist organizations. If Hamas is the governing body of Gaza, Gaza is off the table. So you are seeing a great deal of focus on the West Bank and Ramallah and others. I would add that a problem in that vein is that much of the money that we gave to the Palestinian Authority was also predicated from the G8 and IMF money and other monies was on Salam Fayyad being in office. Salam Fayyad, who is the former Prime Minister of the West Bank, is no longer in office now. Fayyad indeed did do some significant measures that helped grow the Palestinian economy in the West Bank. But the question is now also as far as if money has been given to Abbas, and the fact that Abbas is trying to work with Hamas is tainted money, where that money is going, and the fact that there is a beginning of an understanding that Hamas is off the table and Gaza is not part of this puzzle at this point is a positive sign. But that's where the focus has been, without even going into issues that I've spoken about tonight, vis-a-vis refugees and whatnot. They're going to come about later on. But that it is trying to create some kind of legitimate architecture that would lead the parties to come together. And even now you're seeing people leaving the room because of upset about these issues. Again, to tell you indicators that we do need to address them early on rather than later. The question as far as reparations and Jewish refugees. A very critical aspect. It is the one single issue that when you raise about the double exodus that took place in 48, 49, nobody addresses that because they say, oh, this is a special case. And the reason for that is that many of the Jews who were forced to leave the Arab world, take for example Iraq, were forced to sign documentation. You can leave here with one suitcase without any kind of property if you want to leave here alive, was the message. And so the argument was that you can't, you're not going to get reparations or any kind of compensation. There is, on a positive side, there's been a movement in the United Nations by Jews of Arab lands, Syrians and Egyptians and others, who are trying to raise this issue now and say, you know what, if we're not talking about compensation, let's bring that up. And also there's a similar initiative that was happening in the Knesset. I think that that's legitimate, and if you talk about the numbers, you're talking about close to 900,000 Jews. I myself am married to a Syrian Jew. I'm very well aware of the Syrian Jewish community and what they have gone through at large. This has been while it's an emotional issue, and I think the fact the State of Israel has taken in anybody, any Jewish individual who wants to come to Israel, is put on the back burner. I also relate this back to the issue of the identity aspect of Palestinian refugees, where this has become a guarantee that if you are a Palestinian refugee, you're also a Palestinian identity, and not accepting statehood and whatnot and moving forward. So that mentality has not pushed this along. There's also no UN agency that is pushing this along. So we are pushing it, and it comes off as one-sided, whereas the Palestinian refugee issue in the circles and within the General Assembly at large have become a known entity, and accepted the fact that we have to deal with that, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's where it plays out. That's the balance of power. I mean, I would like to see this resolved. I have a serious doubt that Syria, Iraq will be given back. I mean, even today, just to give you an example, there's been, those of you who are following, there's a great deal about the archives found in Iraq that my friend and colleague Harold Rove, who was at the Department of Defense at DOD, was responsible for. And the question about, is that going to go back to Iraq? And all of the archaeology as far as national treasures are being addressed now, but without taking into consideration about what happened to the Jewish community in those respective states. So yes, it's worthwhile to bring up, even when you talk to policymakers and whatnot. But unfortunately, it's not as a strong argument as Palestinian statehood and Palestinian refugees. The last question that was asked about, and the comment that was made about Australia and Canada. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very positive note that these things are indeed happening. I spoke to policymakers in Perth and other places when I was in Australia last. Australia also has been giving 90, 100 million Australian dollars to these issues and whatnot. And they're asking for more accountability. I think that's a positive thing. I really do believe that the fact that that Western countries are asking for accountability and transparency as far as where their money is going is critical. And until we make those requests, those pronouncements public, then the perception is going to be that you have to give us money because you are responsible for this to a large extent. And you have an obligation. And the number one issue has to be peace in the Middle East. And the fact that we are stateless is because we have nowhere to go to. I mean, these are all this is part of the Arab-Palestinian rhetoric that's being sold, but it's not really necessarily in tune with the reality on the ground. And I think that as Western countries, we should be looking at this. And the fact that Australia is doing that, the fact that Canada did it, all positive things. I mean, and I think that we have to continue on and to actually look at where our money is going. The challenge at large in the West, and the question vis-a-vis related to the Arab Spring, is of course the question of Islamist groups in the region, vis-a-vis Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood. Are they going to democratize or not going to democratize? These are the big questions, and I'm sure we know the challenges that play out here. However, the West at large, we're asking these questions. Well, Hamas was like a democratic group, we must support them. Obviously, we saw that the example of the Morsi government didn't go too far, and Israel deals with that vis-a-vis Hamas on a day-to-day basis. So these are all critical aspects that need to be looked at. But I think as stakeholders, that's what we have to demand the accountability. So I'm all for it.
Okay, that was one of the banks, I think that was the early ones. You also were early.
There was a question here.
1, 2, and 3. Okay. Yes. Next one's already. Yes, please go to the mic.
Yes, hello. Welcome to Germany. I hope you're enjoying your stay.
Thank you.
I very much agree with your assessment that UNRWA is probably one of the, or maybe the most flawed institution of the UN. But I must say, with pretty much everything else you said, I must strongly disagree. I think the key issue is you said that UNRWA has lost its neutrality, or even was never neutral. I would say the key issue is that aid, especially in this context, can never be neutral, and people throwing aid packages over northeast Syria today and think they're doing something neutral. We need to read a little bit more on politics, I believe. Now the key issue is, I think both sides are playing a football game, if I may say so. And we are in the final of the World Cup, and clearly Israel is winning with at least 5 points ahead. Now the problem is, we shouldn't be playing football. There shouldn't be one clear winner and one clear loser. But the solution that you suggest, that there must be an end date to UNRWA, would mean that this game is ending. Logically, the Palestinians want the game to continue because they believe at some point in the future we might be able to win. But Israel wants it to end because, well, they're on the winning side. So no matter what would be the normal solution would be the game ends after 90 minutes. I guess we've been playing for 10 or 11 hours now. No matter what the normal solution is, what can Israel, as being on the winning side clearly right now, do for the Palestinians to resolve the issue of the right of return in a way so that they don't perceive that they are losing, that they feel that they're either in a win-win situation or at least in a situation they can manage with?
We take 3 questions again and then you will try to answer it. And then, who was the third? Yes, you will.
So I'm a student at this university, I'm a student of the Humboldt University. I'm quite ashamed that this university hosts such an event because this perspective is the most one-dimensional perspective on the Mideast conflict I've ever listened to in my life, and the picture...
It's very harmful.
What happened to democracy?
Yeah.
What happened to your democracy? Totalitarian democracy is your game, right?
I would like
We
to
have a right to
continue.
champion too.
Yeah, you do.
Do you have a question? Speak up.
Thank you for your comments. So I disagree with the picture you drew of people living in Palestine buying Macs and iPads and stuff like that, because I think if you go to Hebron, you can see people collecting water on rooftops, people that are not allowed to walk on the streets of their own city, people that are not allowed to leave their own country. And what do you say to this picture of living in Palestine in contrast to the picture you drew? Thank you.
Say your shape.
Maybe you would like to answer this question. It's very interesting.
I think it's more efficient if you have a little bit, he will address all of this.
Well, I have two questions. First of all, sorry for my hard Russian pronunciation. First question, I would ask about some information. All these refugees, are they all Muslim Arabs, or are a part of them Christian Arabs or Druze or some other ethnic or religions? I don't know, I didn't find information. And second question is bigger question. If the Palestinian state will be created, if I'm not optimistic, or maybe optimistic, I don't believe in this, but it's not. If the state will be created, I think it will be typical failed state like Haiti or so on. My question is, can they produce something to produce the food, produce, I don't know, the services and so on? And want they produce something? Or they don't want to produce anything? And when you will ask my question, please say very, very slow.
Sure. Okay, one point that I realized I didn't mention was the question about 242 that was raised before, and I'll start with that. 242 is still the understanding, the modality of peace in the Middle East. And so if you look at, you analyze 242, there's still the question of 67 refugees in Jerusalem, which are addressed in 242. So it is the working model. It's not the only model. Land for Peace worked on the Egyptian side, but you saw also with the peace with Jordan in 1994, there was no exchange of land. It was based on economic incentives, revitalizing the Jordanian economy. So there are different models for peace. However, 242 is, in the Arab psyche, is the only model to work with because they have inserted the word al in Arabic or the in English, referring to the aspect that only that land, the fait accompli on the issue of the land. Also important to note vis-a-vis 242 is that 242 was rejected by the PLO and was only accepted in 1988 in the Algiers conference, which again was the understanding that we'll accept 242 only if it's all the land. That's what led to the beginning of the fact that if you accept 242, we can start from 88 to 1991 to Madrid and going forward to the framework of Oslo. So it's still in the back of people's mind when you talk about potential peace in the region using 242. So that's where that plays out. Okay. The question that was raised here before about the question of the end game and the fact that Israel was winning and how this is played out within the narrative. Neither Palestinians or Israelis are going anywhere. And if you're working within the mentality of the two-state solution, if that's the end goal, and the history of a two-state solution predates the state of Israel, goes back to all the way from 1917, 22, 36, the history all the way to partition of 47, the question of can Arab and Jew live together? And so the question in the pre-1948 era was about sharing the land, and in the post-48 era was about coexisting on the same land. And so if you look at the history of the potential Arab-Jewish state, had the Arabs wanted a state, they could have had one in different parts of history. But without, when understanding the current environment today, if you're looking and trying to a situation where you're going to have a win-win, then that's my point vis-a-vis the idea of putting aside Palestinian refugees. I mean, there has to be, for a functioning Palestinian state to work, and there has to be an acceptance of the other's right to exist. I mean, I sat in these negotiations 20 years ago, and I can guarantee you that much of the narrative hasn't shifted. We used to sit in these meetings until 3, 4 o'clock in the morning and drink coffee and eat hummus and with all our Palestinian counterparts. The moment daybreak came, Arafat declared everything to be null and void. And so the question is, when you're talking about a functioning Palestinian state, is it actually going to, there has to be a valuable economy, a middle class. I 2 years ago, sat in Fayyad's office. Fayyad, I knew him from my days in Ramallah in the old, 20 years ago. And Fayyad did the positive things as far as look at what's happening in Ramallah. There is construction, there is building, there is new things. However, there's a lot of sewer problems and other issues that are happening. And the idea that you want to have a state living side by side that will have a valuable economy is also the acceptance of a functioning state. Related to the economy part of it, about what is the, and I'll address it a bit in length a bit longer. Today, if you look at the Palestinian economy, 99% of the Palestinian economy is based on the VAT exchanges that Israel still continues to pay since 1993. That, for the Israeli economy, is 1%. So to argue that the Palestinians are, that the fact is that, and if they don't get those VAT exchanges, the Palestinian Authority can't pay salaries. And so there's a question about, making sure that there's a functioning Palestinian state. Palestinians can have a state. They can have, Israel, always is offered as far as shared collaboration, technology, whatnot. They talk about, Israel talks about Israel being a startup nation. Palestinians could also have that if they would put aside the ideology and start to look at the functionality of a state. The issue of a win-win, in the Middle East is is not going to work out, in that kind of mentality. First of all, I don't think that Israel is 5 points ahead. I don't think Israel is winning so great. I mean, there are a lot of problems in the Middle East, and part of it is part of what the international community has been doing of late as far as trying to isolate Israel and to demonize Israel. The parties have to come together, and you're not going to avoid direct negotiations. But the number one issue, I will tell you for a fact, as an academic and as someone who's been involved directly with the negotiations, has to be a valuable middle class. What was the number one thing that happened when Abbas was appointed as the Rais, as the chairman of the Palestinian Authority? He went to Gaza. The reception he got in Gaza was they fired live ammo at him because they said, we want jobs, we want change, we want reform. And so to create that has to happen, has to work by sitting together, having a conversation. Money will be coming in to create these projects, to create economic reform, and you have to put aside, there has to be a farewell to arms. And the idea, this idea of, listen, this is not a new concept. When George Mitchell went to the region, who was the architect of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a concept of farewell to arms, equal blame. We've all suffered. We have to move on beyond that. To a large extent, yes, there has to be an acknowledgement that Israel has a right to exist, and the Palestinians have a right to exist. The idea, and this is really the heart of the problem. In addition to the part of the issue that need to be addressed. When one talks about mutual recognition means to the Arab world, and what it means, at large, is putting a mirror in the eyes of the Arab world and saying, if you believe that you have a theological and political right to be in this land, you have to grant that right to Jews as well. And one of the main reasons that all these attempts have failed has been because of Arab rejectionism. To sit down and have, anybody here who's studying international relations, has to be about, mutual recognition and conflict resolution starts with sitting down and having a conversation. And that's never going to happen until you keep on touting out the victimhood mentality. And so that needs to happen. It's just a matter of it's a pragmatic fact that needs to happen if you're going to move along a Palestinian state. The question of what's happening in Palestinian towns and cities. Hebron is one of the Palestinian towns. There has been a great deal of money actually invested in Hebron by the Norwegians under TIPA, Temporary International Presence in Hebron. There are indeed dire conditions in different areas. Actually, the worst place on earth is Gaza. But one of the questions that is never raised is who is responsible for those conditions? And who is responsible for keeping the Palestinians in that dire condition? The narrative has been very clear by Yasser Arafat and others that as long as the Palestinians can blame the West and everybody else and not take responsibility for moving along an agenda, things are not going to change. And that has been an ongoing message. We've seen changes, and the changes have been in the West Bank, of all places. Because in the West Bank, society is much more secular. They're looking for change and whatnot. The number one contractor in the West Bank who's building the fence is Abbas's sons. The new neighborhood Aram outside of Ramallah is also built by Palestinians. Jobs are coming in. There is money coming in. But there's a question about widespread, about where this money is cascading through Palestinian society. All the money Arafat raised in the 90s never even rested in Gaza, let alone got to the Palestinian people. So while it's nice to say that it's all about Israel and the West to blame, and it's all about the fact that Israel is not taking there has to be accountability and responsibility by the Palestinian people to have their own change. And that is yet to happen. And what I've said here all night, and I will say it again, that the number one issue has to be, putting aside the refugee mentality, creating a valuable middle class that would lead to a functioning state. It is much easier to say I'm a victim forever without taking any kind of accountability or transparency for my own actions. And if there was a state tomorrow, then they would have to do that. You can no longer say we're not responsible for our own people. And so that's part of that limbo situation that has existed within this environment. So the relationship, related to economic products. That's what we're trying to do. The idea of, actually, you might remember in disengagement from Gaza, the greenhouses were left to create a product. The idea of creating startups and Palestinian startups. Part of the biggest fallacy, the biggest challenge that existed in the 90s, you had many Palestinian entrepreneurs who came after Arafat, after 1994, after Gaza and Jericho first. And when they came back, they came with the idea that we can help the Palestinian economy, academics, startup people and whatnot. And they all left. And the reason for that was because of the corruption that existed within the Palestinian Authority and the PLO at the time. And it's still been a problem. And so they were kind of disillusioned by the idea that Arafat was going to make this happen. Even people like, Edward Said and others who were, very supportive of the idea of a Palestinian state, the corruption turned them off. They changed. They're very cautious about the kind of language they use while touting the idea of Palestinian nationalism at the same time. So yes, there are attempts to make these changes happen. The argument that Palestinians could be a startup nation, in the same vein that the Israelis are, is something that has been sold in trying to attempt technology and whatnot. Those are all products that can happen, but that is part of the makeup of an actual state and taking responsibility and moving things along. Fayyad did that. Fayyadism, to a large extent, created small industries, created the opportunity to bring in more money, and so Fayyad did that with Western taxpayer dollars. He wasn't able to move this along because he was always cut off by Abbas and Hamas who just wanted the money without following through. And that's why you see that disparity between Gazan economy and West Bank economy. And so you have to look at it from that perspective. If there is these negotiations under Kerry are going to succeed, and there's going to be a movement, the revitalizing Palestinian economy is the number one issue for all of these negotiators. They've always put the economy as the number one issue. While I agree the Palestinian economy and economic incentives are critical, you, as a student of the region and of history, I can tell you, if you do not address the historical and the theological problems that exist in the region, it can't happen in a vacuum. It has to go in tandem. And you have to work on both sides.
Constantine was one of the next. And then here. And the second question by Adila. Okay, those are the thanks.
Thanks for your interesting talk, and I have a very simple question. How is there a mandate from UNRWA only for the West Bank and for Gaza, or also for Lebanon and Syria? And if so, what are they actually doing there? Because no one in the Palestine Solidarity is talking about Palestinians in Syria. So what's happening? What is the status and what's laid down in their prescription?
Wolfgang Bock, I have one remark to the discussion and one question. The remark to the discussion is a student asked why he could only hear this once in his life, what has been told here. So there is an answer to this question. There are very few newspapers in Germany who even give some information on these points. Debate is one newspaper who does it sometimes. The Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung usually doesn't. If you look at the press in the United States or in other countries of the Near and Middle East, you find quite a lot more newspapers who give these informations. If you look at the politics of the United States, you'll find the Republican Party, at least half of them, are convinced that all these questions matter, and they have many information on these problems. They discuss these problems. So if you go to the United States and look at the political discussion, you'll find it all. You can read it every day. If you go into the internet, you should like into Sandbox by Martin Kramer, where you find each day about 5 to 15 articles from well-known newspapers from all over the world who discuss all these questions. most people in German politics and in German scientific discussions on these questions don't look into these informations. Take the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, which is financed by the federal government, who usually only have people who say, how can you work together with the Palestinian side? That's the only question. There's no question why all those people said, beginning from 1998 till today, the Muslim Brotherhood is a kind of Christian democracy within the Arab states. Carlos said that already before he became director of the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in 1998. So now we have the discussion in Egypt, but only 20% of our people who deal with the Near Middle East took up this discussion earlier. Most of the well-known people within politics, scientific community, and newspapers didn't discuss it thoroughly and looking at all the consequences. Anyway, so that's only a hint on the situation of the discussion in West Germany and in many European countries. It's different from the discussion in other countries. My question is a small one. Do you know anybody, if I remember right what you said there went billions and billions of dollars to UNRWA during all the time. Do you know anybody who figured it out exactly how much they got during all the years? Do you know any calculation on this point?
If you email, I'll give you my card. I have a truck with the brake.
It's fine.
We have someone else. First.
Yeah.
You can have a question.
Okay, so I just have a specific question to the right of return in terms of German neo-Nazis, because German neo-Nazis also have this assessment of right of return of Germans who have been expelled from the East, in particular from Poland and Czech Republic. So this is a hardcore, of course, revisionist position, which is only shared by neo-Nazis in Germany until today. And I know that Omar Barghouti, who is the co-founder of the BDS movement, as you know, he said in Berlin at an event in the Taz Cafe, which is a left-wing hardcore daily actually, and he said at an event that he also is in favor of the right of return of Germans who have been expelled from the East. So, can we say, do you know of discussions that there is a kind of pro-German approach in these UNRWA and pro-Palestinian communities? That means, what is the connection between neo-Nazis and these people?
Alright, so the question that was raised first of all as far as the mandate. The mandate of UNRWA also includes also Lebanon and Syria as far as the refugee camps. I mean, the focus has been only on West Bank and Gaza, but the mandate for when UNRWA's numbers, it includes Palestinians worldwide and Palestinian diaspora. It also includes Syria and Lebanon. Interestingly enough, one of the biggest camps in Lebanon is Nahar al-Bard. And Nahar al-Bard is one of the main feeders for Al-Qaeda and Hamas and other groups that are happening as far as the connection between those camps and terrorism. And so as far as the mandate goes, they work within those camps as well. They are not as, their strength as a political entity in those countries, because they are dealing with state actors. Again, take that with a grain of salt, obviously, given the collapse of Syria these days, has been not as influential as it's been within the Palestinian Authority and how they work there. So that hold on Palestinian society, we only see that within the areas of the West Bank and Gaza. But they do work within all these areas where there are located camps, and we are seeing those connections. There was another question here that I forgot to raise before as far as, are they only Muslim? No, they're Arab Christian, Palestinian Christians who are also considered to be refugees in their accounts. Vis-a-vis for example, the BDS movement, many of those Palestinian Christians are the main catalysts in Presbyterian churches in the United States, for example, who have been pushing boycott out of the churches on these matters. So you are seeing that connection there too. However, the majority are Muslims, but you do have Christians that are involved within this population. The question, Clemens' question, as far as, right?
The numbers?
Oh, the numbers. A gentleman who asked about the breakdown of all the monies, if you give me your card, I will send you, I don't have it off the top of my head, I give you the breakdown from 1948 to today about the numbers in dollars and how much they've given. So, not a problem. The mentality as far as, the question as far as the ideology, yes, the rejectionist ideology, you've seen a lot of that played out as far as rejectionism, Nazism, goes back to, as you know very well, with the issue of the Mufti and the deal with Palestinian identity, all feeds into that ideology and that mentality. The argument, whether or not these voices within the General Assembly are being used as a way to galvanize the cause within the General Assembly by different countries, specifically Germany and other countries, yes, we've seen that as in a full swept kind of movement. People like Barghouti, tend to gloss over history in the same way that he also denied, he also doesn't want to talk about the fact that he is receiving his PhD from the University of Tel Aviv, but he still claims Israel is an apartheid state. I mean, so, Barghouti should be taken with a grain of salt. I think within the rhetoric and within the kind of the mentality, Holocaust rhetoric is for sure found within Palestinian identity. We see it, in the contemporary. We see it, with the cartoons. We see it with the kind of comparison between Nakba and Holocaust. That's where it comes from. As far as it relates to the right of return, it is fed to that narrative. But I have not done a study to break down the voices within the General Assembly that are saying, because of that ideology, you're pushing this issue. It is a kind of accepted norm that the right of return and Palestinian refugees are as a result of Israel's creation. It's Israel's responsibility and the West to solve that. As such, you have to pay large sums of money to make that happen. And that was the reality that was given in the post-48 era. But you are, but it's hard to quantify. But I'm sure, that I haven't done. But maybe you want.
Before we take the last round of short questions, Clemens' remark reminds me of one thing that I always, in discussions I talk about very often. In Europe, you're right. My father comes from a place that's not Poland. We have peace now in Europe, and of course, nobody would dare to say we want that land back or we want to move back there. So in a way, it's land for peace, but the other way around. And Germany, of course, attacked its neighbors twice and lost the war. And there's the fact that Israel was attacked in 5 wars. And sometimes you lose a little land. Still, yes, you need to find a solution, but you cannot just claim we have to go back, we have to do turn back the clock. I think that's what he meant. And so that's how, if you keep telling we have to go back, we're refugees, then you're almost like neo-Nazi terminology saying we want the eastern parts of Germany back. So that's my opinion on that. It tells how really wrong this whole narrative is.
Entschuldigung, können wir bitte den Holocaust-Vergleich nicht in einer deutschen Debatte bringen? Das ist immer ein Totschlagargument.
Was für ein Holocaust?
Natürlich, sobald man jemanden mit einem Nazi vergleicht, dann ist er sofort abgestempelt. Wenn ich eine Sache sagen darf, das Wichtige an der Debatte ist, wir sind nicht Palästinenser, nicht Israel. Wir dürfen nicht angreifen. Wir müssen nur
Excuse me, I don't understand you.
Oh, sorry. I was just criticizing that it's very, very wrong in German debate. It's usually taboo to bring the Nazi comparison.
Never did that, okay?
It was Omar Al-Houthi who did this comparison. Oh my god, so stupid guy. Oh my god. If this is typical Humboldt students, that's very fun. It's really in Humboldt University. Oh god.
I just added that in Europe also we cannot just reclaim and say we are refugees, otherwise peace will be lost.
One point on that, just to add to that, the Clemens' question. The image of the Palestinian as the eternal refugee, it feeds into that larger narrative. And basically, that is the reason why the BDS movement and others have adopted the underdog cause embodied within the Palestinian narrative. And so that idea that we are refugees forever is all fed and it cascades through different mechanisms to make that happen vis-a-vis soft power and other aspects, but that is where this comes from. And so, yes, I mean, we're seeing a lot of these elements play out here, but that's where this, aspect and the strength of this right of return, this claim of internal refugees.
Okay, last round. 3 brief questions. Elena was first, one in the back. Any third one? If not, we can wait 2, and and brief questions and brief answers, and then I have one announcement, and then we go to wine and juice and get on discussing.
Sorry. I just wanted to say 2 things to the 2 young gentlemen here. University is a place of debate. There's no reason to be ashamed or even, angry about the fact that we're talking about topics which you don't like. First of all. Second of all, Professor Schumann is a professor at this university, so he's also at home here, not only you.
I'm not from this university.
Now, I have to speak about this young gentleman who studies here. I just wanted to say that you forgot that Hebron was a Jewish city, holy to the Jews, because the grave of Abraham is there. And Jews and Arabs lived peacefully for hundreds of years there until 1936. There was a very big pogrom against the Jews of Hebron. They were murdered and thrown away. Okay? Just remember this.
My name is Sylvia Czernovsky. My question is going on to the term of a Palestinian refugee. I do agree that the term of Palestinian refugee is not very nice and probably not the right one. What would you suggest for a solution that the Palestinian refugees, what kind of citizenship they could have got? Would they all be Palestinian state citizenship, or would they be Israeli, or would they be Syria, or would they be Lebanon?
Concerning the peace process, is a final status agreement realistic now, or do we need a transition period?
The question of Palestinian citizenship and how that would play out. Up until 1948, the war, I mean, the area defined as Palestine, there were Arabs in Palestine and Jews in Palestine. And so there was that environment. What happens post that is the question of the Arab state to be, if it's going to be a state in Palestine. So if there's going to be a Palestinian state, and they would receive, even when you go from Oslo on, they would receive Palestinian passports and whatnot, elevated Palestinian state. The idea that would be the Palestinian state. The question, there was a question that we raised in Oslo. That was one of the ideas. Well, could you compromise and have dual citizenship? Jewish state and Palestinian areas, would they receive dual citizenship and have and that was flatly rejected. That was not the working definition. The idea was, and it still is, how does one carve out a contiguous Palestinian state and eventually lead to 2 states living side by side? And the Palestinian Authority, if we become the Palestinian state, would have all the functionalities of that state, issuing passports, diplomatic status and whatnot. Your question about relates to other countries, vis-a-vis Syria, Egypt, and others. If they have dual citizenship, I mean, currently now what you have is there are Palestinians living in Europe, Palestinians living in Germany. They have German citizenship. There are Palestinians living in the United States. They have American citizenship. And so, by UNRWA's accounts, they are still entitled to a right of return to the Palestinian state to be. Whether or not they would give up their citizenship in a Western country, from the survey that I've done, most likely not the case. However, they are entitled, based on the definition of UNRWA's, who is a refugee, they fall under that category. In the Arab world, they have, with the exception of Jordan, like I said, they haven't been afforded citizenship because they maintain in that refugee status. They have gotten a better class in Syria before the Arab Spring. In Lebanon, it's quite different because Lebanon has a whole other ball of issues because of Hezbollah's control of the Lebanese parliament. But so there's been this attempt to keep them in that open status. And so what the assumption is that if there's a Palestinian state that comes to fruition, they all go there. That's where this plays out. That's the practical evidence. I mean, so it's a little more complicated, but that's the assumption that would happen. Okay, answer your question? Well, okay. The question
was, do we need transitions?
Yeah, you're right. I think that a transition is going to be inevitable because what you are seeing is that what happened is that we're further away than where we were in 1991. I mean, bringing the parties together, to Miguel's question as far as what Kerry and General Al have been doing, they were trying to get two parties together to create infrastructure. That being said, if you remember from Oslo was designed as an almost 7-year process. And with the idea of land swaps, large Palestinian cities and whatnot, to create the environment where you would have, eventually you'd have two areas, A and C, A being all the Palestinian areas, C was the white areas on the map, which become the state of Israel, and you would have two states. That prolonged process and putting on the back burner right of return, Jerusalem, and ultimately all issues is what led to the collapse. So yes, you have to bring the two parties together to create an infrastructure. The framework of what's going to happen has to be set from the get-go. And so if you look at the Oslo documents and the Declaration of Principles, the idea there, they didn't say when they were going to deal with that. They said we're going to deal with it at some point when we come to that juncture. That has to be dealt head on. I mean, otherwise, again, when you have the right of return, you have the issue that this is going to be festering. Unless you set a clear timeline, then it continues to go on and on. And that has to be. But again, the way it works out is bringing the two parties together, trying to agree upon a certain framework for working together, and moving this along. And that's what you are seeing. Attempting to see.